standard post Rosh Hashanah. We haven't even got to Yom Kippur. Right, I want to welcome Rabbanit Nechama Barash this evening. Highly recommended from members of Al Kahira who heard her speak. And the topic of the shir is very much in line with where we are at the moment in the Secretary Meir Shuvah, saying I'm sorry really enough. As I mentioned, Rabbanit Barash is originally from Philadelphia. We can't all be perfect, but at least I understand they have cream cheese there, if nothing else. And graduated from Stern College, where I think I currently have a cousin teaching at Stern College, I believe. And then has been involved in a number of things, and is including a master's degree in Gemara at Bar Ilan, and is a graduate of Nishmat's Yoetzet Halacha program. And I think we've had a few connections with that particular program. We're very pleased to have yet another graduate from that program, because it is such an important program for the Kehillah. And has more recently been involved in teaching in a number of places, including being the director of the Pardes Learning Seminar. And I believe we've also had participants from there, both within the Kehillah and from without. So we are delighted to welcome you here today to share with us. I think I have made you co-host.
Yes, I have. Good, because I'm going to share my source sheet, of course, and I'm happy to email you the sources afterwards, so you can send that to not here.
I appreciate it.
How long is the shiur, Rabbi Wilkinson?
As long as you want it to be. I think we've got till you want to go to bed, really.
Okay. So you're saying up to an hour is acceptable?
I think it's acceptable. If they can't throw tomatoes at me tonight. It's safe. They can't heckle me. It's you're welcome to speak.
Okay. So good evening to everyone. It's an honor and a pleasure to be joining you tonight to teach a little Torah before Yom Kippur. And what I want to talk about is really a subject, the Inyane Diyoma, right? The matters of the day, really, which is the move towards Yom Kippur is a time for introspection. It's a time for reflection. And one of the things that is emphasized, and we'll see in the Shulchan Aruch and in the Gemara and so on, is the need to reconcile with other people. Right? The understanding is we have falling outs, there are hurts, there are betrayals, there are insults, there are offenses that take place, sometimes intentionally, sometimes unintentionally, and those accumulate. And this becomes a time of year where we do a kind of bedek bayit, where we do an internal housekeeping. And really we're meant to be thoughtful about who we need to ask forgiveness from, maybe also who we need to accept forgiveness from if they approach us. And the reality, of course, is that sending a message or calling someone Erev Yom Kippur to say, do you meichel me? Do you forgive me? Is really not going to get the job done if there's any serious infraction, any significant rupture that's taken place. And so, how long does it take? How much work is really necessary from the moment I decide I need to apologize until I can honestly stand before a person that I've wronged and ask for forgiveness? And how much time does it take for the person who was hurt to be able to receive that forgiveness? What kind of processes need to be in place internally and externally for that meeting to happen? And so, while at this time of year, there's an encouragement to ask for forgiveness, the reality is that unless you've done the work all year towards that forgiveness, it's unlikely to really happen. And what I often encourage my students to think about is, what kind of work can you begin doing this year that might lead to a true reconciliation, a true forgiveness by this time next year? And I'll share a story I like to take from popular culture There is a show called The Good Doctor on Netflix. I know it's an American show. I don't know how often you guys watch American TV, but it's quite a good show. And the storyline that I found particularly compelling on the eve of preparing for this shiur was one in which Dr. Glassman, Jewish doctor, of course, who's in his 60s, I would say, or towards the end of his career. And he's recovering from brain surgery. He has some cancer. And he begins to be reflective about earlier events in his life. And he shares with his young colleague a story in which he had maliciously written in his 18-year-old female crush's yearbook 40 years earlier. And for 40 years, he's been carrying around the sense of wrong he did to this woman, that he wrote something deliberately malicious to hide his feelings, to hide his sense of rejection. It doesn't really matter. And so in the course of the episode, they set out to find this woman. They know her name. They don't know where she lives. They find that there are 7 women with the same name in the state that they're in. And they go from house to house. Of course, because it's a TV show, the last house they get to is the house of this woman. And what I want to focus on is that moment. He knocks on the door. She opens the door. And when she sees him, she calls him by his name and she remembers him. But she doesn't remember the insult, right? And he's been carrying this for 40 years and he needs to put it down. Now, she doesn't brush it off. She doesn't say, look, it doesn't really matter. I don't remember. She welcomes him into her home. She serves him tea and she allows him to apologize. It's actually a very beautiful moment because we often think that fragile dynamic against the giving the apology and the receiving the apology. She doesn't need the apology anymore, but she understands that he needs to apologize. And she allows him that space. And only after he leaves, they have this, meet up and they reminisce and so on. She takes out the yearbook, she opens it, and you see that she, with a very strong pen, has crossed out what he wrote to her. It was so hurtful, right? So even though, right, like, so she kind of nods as she shuts the yearbook, but that, that it had become a memory for her. And I guess if we're lucky, right, then maybe the people we hurt eventually forget. But that doesn't mean that we let go of the sense of wrong we do to someone else. And so that delicate dance of how do we apologize, right? It took Dr. Glassman 40 years to get up the courage to really own up to what he had done in hurting the 18-year-old, former 18-year-old woman. And it took, and there's a journey, right? The journey across the state looking to find this woman. And so I bring that, it's an extreme, but many of us hold on to either the hurts that we experienced or often even more likely those that we hurt, even though they've let it go, right? And so how do we create the space for true forgiveness? And so what I want to bring are a number of stories in the Talmud that take place on Erev Yom Kippur. And some of them really end successfully with successful reconciliation, and some of them end terribly. And I want to contrast the ones in which there really is a successful forgiveness, a moment of release, and those in which there are not. Because I think, as with everything in the Gemara, there are lessons waiting there for us for today, for the here and now. So I'm going to share my screen right now. Okay. So what we're going to look at, this was actually last year, so the date needs to be updated. So it says in Yoma, in Masechet Yoma, for transgressions between man and the omnipresent, meaning HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Yom HaKippurim procures atonement. For transgressions between man and his fellow man, what we like to call Ben Adam Lechavero, Yom HaKippurim does not procure atonement until he has pacified his fellow man. And this is so interesting because we tend to think of God as a somewhat harsh and unforgetting and maybe at times unforgiving judge and jury and policeman. But the reality is, Yoma says, as soon as we make the move towards HaKadosh Baruch Hu, as soon as we cry out in regret, as soon as we show a movement towards tshuva, HaKadosh Baruch Hu forgives, and Yom Kippurim will forgive, regardless. Maybe even if I don't do active tshuva, that doesn't mean that the next day it doesn't begin to accumulate. But Yom Kippurim is such a powerful experience that Yoma says Yom Kippurim on its own procures atonement for Ben Adam Lamako, for those sins between us and God. But when it comes to our fellow human beings, that doesn't work at all. There is nothing automatic about forgiveness if we have wronged Ben Adam L'Chavero. And that's where the work has to begin. And so now I want to quote Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, because how can we not? So much depth and beauty in what he writes at all the time, all year. Forgiveness is not just one idea among many. It transformed the human situation. For the first time, it established the possibility that we are not condemned endlessly to repeat the past. When I repent, I show I can change. The future is not predestined. I can make it different from what it might have been. And when I forgive, I show that my reaction is not a mere reaction the way revenge should be. Forgiveness breaks the irreversibility of the past. It is the undoing of what has been done. Repentance and forgiveness, the two great gifts of human freedom, redeem the human condition from tragedy. So eloquent, so beautifully expressed. I want to focus on this one particular line. It established the possibility that we are not condemned endlessly to repeat the past. And it's one of the things I spoke with a young woman today in a relationship, a serious relationship, and the couple has gotten into a cycle of fighting for a lot of different reasons, right? Unfortunately, couples sometimes find themselves in these cycles and they want to break the cycle. And we talked about the kind of work that's necessary to break a pattern of behavior, a cycle of behavior. It is not impossible, but and that is what is unique to the human, right? That we are able to break the endless repetitions of the past. But nothing in what Rabbi Sachs writes suggests that it's easy or automatic or rote. It's a gift. It redeems us. But we have to be able to be intentional, to be aware, and to do the work necessary. And so now we're going to take a look at some of these stories. Hold on one second. Okay. I'm in Yoma 87a because the Gemara wrote in Aramaic. I'm going to just read it in English so I don't have to double translate, right? The Gemara relates that Rabbi Yirmiyah insulted Rabbi Abba, causing the latter to have a complaint against him. Now, what I love about the Gemara is the realness, the authenticity, the fact that even rabbis, right, holy men who spend their days learning Torah and davening and teaching us and so on, have moments of human frailty, have moments in which there is imperfection. And Rabbi Yirmiyah went and sat at the threshold of Rabbi Abba's house to beg him for forgiveness. When Rabbi Abba's maid poured out the dirty water, the water landed on Rabbi Yirmiyah's head. And what did he say? Me'ashpot yarim evyon, right? It's a quote from Tehillim, and he says, I have been raised up from the trash heap, right? I have turned into a trash heap. The dirty water, the refuse from the house has been poured on my head. And me'ashpot yarim evyon, this idea that who lifts up the needy out of the trash heap. And when Rabbi Abba heard what happened, he went out to greet him. And Rabbi Abba then said, now I have to go appease him because he's become insulted by sitting outside my house asking for forgiveness. And what does he then quote? Because he quotes something from Mishlei, Lech hitrapes or hav reacha. Go humble yourself, hitrapes, and urge your neighbor. Now, what I love about this story is the amount of movement, right? Rabbi Yirmiyah insults Rabbi Abba. He goes to Rabbi Abba's house. He doesn't knock on the door. He is not sure he will be received. When you hurt someone, you don't always call them on the phone or send them a WhatsApp or knock on the door. You have to be a little more subtle. So he goes to sit outside of the threshold to beg for forgiveness. He is not invited over the doorstep. And so he does not cross that space. He's outside begging for forgiveness. And while he's sitting there, he undergoes a humiliating experience. It's not the only story in which something like this happens in the Gemara. And what he says is, Me'ashpot yarim avion, I am so low right now with garbage poured over me that I can only rise up from here, right? It's this understanding that I have to lower myself in order to really ask for forgiveness. And when Rabbi Abba hears this, that his colleague, his friend has been humiliated inadvertently by his maid, he says, oh my God, I have to go out and greet my friend. This is not what I intended should happen. I have to go appease him, right? So he also moves over the threshold and he go humble yourself. He quotes a verse from Mishlei. Now I have to go humble myself towards Rabbi Yirmiyah. Okay, and so this really, it's in Yoma, it's the introduction to the story I'm leading up to, but it shows how tenuous, how fragile, and how much, not just work, right? There are emotional steps of moving yourself downward in order to be lifted up in the process of forgiveness. It is related when Rabbi Zera had a complaint against a person, he would pace back and forth before him and present himself. So again, Rabbi Zera was hurt or people insulted him, and he would just set himself up wherever the person was and pace back and forth so the person could come and appease him. And again, notice the motion in the story. Rabbi Zera, who's the one who is waiting for the apology, doesn't sit passively waiting for the apology. He wants the person to apologize. He wants to encourage him. He makes himself visible, but ultimately he has to wait until the person is willing to slow him down and say, hey, Rabbi Zera, I'm sorry, right? What does it take to seek forgiveness, to accept forgiveness? How available do we make ourselves for those moments? Okay, and now comes the story I really want to focus in on. Here I'm actually going to read the story in the original just because I want to like lean into it. It's the English starts. I'm actually going to just move the Hebrew, the Aramaic really up, so you can see where I'm taking from. Rav Havala Milta Bahade Hahu Tabcha. So the story starts out, right? We've had Rabbi Yirmiyah who hurt or insulted Rabbi Abba. We have Rabbi Zera who actively goes out and is visible to those who have upset him so they can see he's available to accept forgiveness and to accept their apology. Now we have Rav who has a complaint against a certain butcher. And I often say to my students, what do you think that complaint was, right? What kind of complaint do we have against service providers, possibly against butchers? Does anyone want to, I see your cameras are off, so I don't know if people are actively listening. I hope you are, but does anyone want to unmute themselves and share what they think a complaint against a butcher? Why might a customer have a complaint against a butcher? Any thoughts? No one answered.
Meat's off.
What? The meat's off. Beautiful.
Meat's off.
I bought meat last week and it's a little spoiled. And I have to be honest, that once happened to me at a butcher and I actually never went back to that butcher, right? Like, because I have options, I don't have to go to only one butcher. But if this butcher is the butcher in town and the meat was off, the customer has a legitimate complaint. Good. So I think that's a really good example where the meat is off. What anyone else? Thank you, Tina. Have a suggestion why you might have a complaint against your meat provider? And I think that actually, if I'm thinking of London, I think there was a pretty big story a few oh no, was it in it was in South Africa when I was in South Africa for Limud, right? Why might a Rav have a complaint against a butcher?
I'm not a Rav, but I think I would complain if there was too much fat around the meat.
Too much fat around the meat, right? Maybe he wasn't careful trimming the fat, which might lead to questions of kashrut, right? He didn't remove the chalev perhaps, but also kashrut issues. Unfortunately, every so often, there's a terrible scandal where a kosher butcher is caught selling non-kosher meat. I'm sure not by you, and thank God not by me, but like things happen and then it explodes and everyone gets very anxious. So maybe he's been padding the meat a little with what he shouldn't be. Any other? One more option. So we said kashrut. The meat is not quality meat, or maybe the meat he's selling spoiled meat. Good. Anything else where we might have a suspicion?
Wrong weight or misweighing the meat.
Beautiful. He's cheating us, right? The weights are off. He's overpriced. We're catching him in various, lack of integrity as a service provider, as a with our money. And so any of those are possible complaints. I will say that the story does not tell us what the complaint is. So I want to pause. We're going to come back to what's possibly happening. Okay. Lo ata lekame. Well, now it turns out as we're going to, lo ata lekame. The butcher never comes to apologize. Rav seems to make a little note in his book. Butcher has not apologized. B'male Yoma de Kippure, Erev Yom Kippur. Amar Ihu, Rav says to himself, Ezel ana lefusele. You know what? I'm going to go. Now, if we translate it correctly, to appease him, but we as readers know Rav is seeking appeasement. In other words, he's not going to apologize to the butcher. He's going to make sure the butcher apologizes to him. Okay, that already makes it an interesting story, because anyone who has siblings, anyone who has raised children knows that when we say, go apologize to your brother, sorry, and then the sibling says, Mom, he didn't mean it. He didn't mean it. You made him do it, right? We all understand that it is literally impossible to force someone to apologize to you in any convincing way. And Rav basically says, it's Erev Yom Kippur. I took out my book. The butcher wronged me. I have to go seek appeasement. Now, I'm not going to apologize because Rav did nothing wrong in his mind. The butcher has to apologize so that I can make a little check, so I can forgive him. And then we can go into Yom Kippur and everyone can be happy. Okay, so that is the background to this story. Pagabe Rav Huna, as he's marching along the street, very self-righteous, ready to get the job done, Rav Huna encounters him. Amar le lahecha ka'azil mar. Where's Mar going? Where are you going, sir? Amar le if you say the planya, I'm going to go cause appeasement to someone. Amar azil abba lemiktel nafshe. And now Rav Huna says something really, really startling. He says, Rav is going to cause someone's death, right? Now, Rav Huna is the omniscient narrator in this story, right? And part of what we already understand is someone's going to die. We're not yet sure who. And I think if I want to be a little more literary or use it as a metaphor, there's going to be the death of a relationship, right? You can't go and force an apology. It doesn't work. Either the person's ready to ask for forgiveness or they're not. You can't show up Erev Yom Kippur and say, okay, I'm here. You can apologize now. It's just not going to, things don't work that way. And Erev Yom Kippur, really, that's what you're doing? So what happens? Azel v'kami lua. He nonetheless kept going, and he walked into the shop and stood before the butcher. Havayati v'kapale reshe. And what we find out is the butcher is sitting and flaying the rosh, the head of the animal. Which again, we could do a lot with why the head, not the tail, right? It's the head, not the tail. And why is it dafka the head? Dal eine v'chazeh. He lifted his eyes and saw Rav standing there. Amarle Abaat. Are you the guy they call Abba? Zil, get out. Lately milta bahadach. Now the writer does something, in my opinion, brilliant here. Get out. I want to have no words with you. Now, the reason it's brilliant is, until this point in the story, I assumed the butcher wronged Rav. And it's possible that is what happened, and the butcher doesn't want to apologize. But that kind of aggressive response, Erev Yom Kippur, to Rav's presence injects the possibility that maybe Rav wronged the butcher. And he didn't come to apologize because he thinks Rav needs to apologize to him. And Rav is standing there waiting for the apology. And he says, get out. I have no words with you. And of course, any of us who have been in any sort of service-based industry, we say the customer is always right. Anyone want to share with me, perhaps, if you have been in any catering, service providing, industry, whatever it is, the customer, is the customer always right? Anyone want to weigh in on that? Why might the customer be in the wrong? Why might the butcher have a ta'ana, have a complaint against Rav? Anyone?
Maybe he badmouthed him.
Beautiful. Maybe Rav did get once meat that was off. Maybe I could even say he, and he just badmouthed the butcher. I bought the meat there and it was like really off. Don't go there, right? Instead of maybe returning it, getting his money back, getting a new piece of meat, it could be he just went around saying the meat's off, right? Don't go by there, right? It's possible, right? He badmouthed him. Maybe there was a kashrus battle, right? And Rav went around, well, the guy's not really kosher. Who knows? But we understand suddenly, because of the way the story is being told, that it's actually not as clear as it was when I first started telling the story. And when Rav Huna says, Rav marching along Erev Yom Kippur to get seek forgiveness, really to get an apology, it's just not going to work. This doesn't happen. And Rav Huna already lets us know there's complexity here. This isn't a clear cut case. This isn't cut and dry. And so what happens next is, and of course we already know someone's going to die, Bahade de kapale reshe ishtamit garma umachya bakue vakatle. So what happens is he becomes distracted, it seems to me. Again, if you're holding a big meat cleaver, it's like operating dangerous machinery. You do not want to become distracted. He becomes distracted, maybe hits the head harder than he should. A bone flies off, strikes him in his throat and kills him, right? And so he dies. The Gemara then tries to justify Rav. I don't want to go into, where the Gemara goes after that, and so on. This piece of the story really stands alone. And I think is brilliant because this question of who's right and who's wrong, especially in matters of commerce, especially when it comes to a customer and a service provider, right, is really complicated and looks different depending on the lens in which you tell the story. And regardless, whether you're on Rav's side or the butcher's side, the butcher dies. There's no reconciliation. There's no apology. Rav has failed to get an apology from the butcher. There is no pius. There is no appeasement. Okay, what I want to look at next is really, hold on one second, is the next story I bring. Right here, I continue bringing the story in the Gemara. There's no time now, so I'm going to continue on. The next story I want to look at, and really this is one of my favorite stories. I just think it's a beautiful story, and it's a story about the work that I keep talking about. Okay, Tanu Rabbanan Hadan Chavero the Kafschut Danino Todeschut. So we have this idea that whoever judges his neighbor favorably is himself judged favorably. And so we say, yes, judge people favorably. Of course, we should judge people favorably. Dan Makaf Schlut, very good. But in reality, how many of us are able to do that when push comes to shove? When you're waiting in a long line and someone cuts the line, right? How many of us are really able to not get annoyed and judge the person favorably, right? Like so many little moments when we judge people for behaving badly. And maybe they have a backstory. Let's see the story. Okay. A story is told of a certain man who came down from the Upper Galilee and was engaged by an employer in the south for 3 years. So what I have here taking place in Israel, a person comes from the Galil down to the south, let's say Beersheba, He's coming as like a sharecropper, as an indentured servant or a worker, however you want to put it. And he works for 3 years, and he's supposed to collect his wages at the end of 3 years, and he has not gone home in 3 years. Okay, even though Israel's not that big, if you don't have any money, you don't have any money. And he's living with his employer. On Erev Yom Kippur, he requested of his employer, give me my wages that I may go and feed my wife and children. It's time, it's Erev Yom Kippur, I want to go home. Erev Yom Kippur, I want to be with my family. It's been 3 years. I have no money, he replied. Give me produce, he demanded. I have none, he replied. Give me land. I have none. Give me cattle. I have none. Give me pillows and bedding. I have none. So 3 years of work, presumably kind of flushed down the drain. He has nothing to show. So what does he do? What would you expect before, I mean, you can see the story, but I'm just going to ask you, what would you expect to happen? How might a person respond? How might we respond to discover that after 3 years of work with someone we trusted and lived among, we're walking out with nothing? Anyone? What could have the scene looked like? What could the scene look like? I prefer a little active participation only because it's late and, like, you know, we're learning together. So anyone want to tell me, like, if you were writing the story, what would that scene look like?
You'd get really angry.
Really angry. He might start grabbing things. Again, he's in the house. He looks around. There are things in the house. The house isn't empty, right? So anger. What else might he do? What might we do if that happened? Who could we go to? Anyone? Where could we go? Maybe we could go to the police. We can go to the Beit Din. We could maybe hail down curses on his head. It's Erev Yom Kippur, right? Like all sorts of things we could do. And what does this man, and notice, by the way, there are no names in this story, and that's very, I think, deliberate, right? Like, this could be anybody. And he slung his things behind him and went home depressed. So he's depressed. The story tells me, pachei nefesh, he's in like the dregs of his soul. It's really sad. It's really hard. But he does not explode or yell or curse or do anything offensive. Okay, that's really an important turning point in the story for what happens next. After the festival, his employer took his wages in his hand together with 3 laden asses, donkeys, one bearing food, another drink, the third various sweets, and he went to his house. Okay, so after the festival means after Sukkot. So 2 weeks go by. The employee, you can imagine, after 3 years, he walks into the house and his wife's like, where's the money that's going to go towards our building, you know, our house? And he's like, I don't have anything. You've been away for 3 years and you don't have anything? But again, the curtain is drawn on that scene. We imagine it. 2 weeks later, the employer shows up with 3 donkeys laden with food, drink, meaning wine, and sweets. And he went into his house. Now, what I love about this is that before he gives him anything, he goes into the house of his employee, which means he crosses over the threshold, which means that his employee opens the door and lets him in, right? If we talk about moments in which movement happens, in which there can be reconciliation, he knocks on the door, the door opens, he crosses the threshold into the home of his employee. And I want to not skip over how significant that is, because I don't want to ask you, your camera, we're not in a classroom, but how many people actually go to break bread in the home of their employees, right? Not that many people do it. If we have someone who comes to clean our house, service our car, whatever, there are multiple people that, again, work for us in different ways. And how many of us go into their homes? Maybe some of you do, right? But that crossing of the threshold, particularly when there's a socioeconomic parity, is not a simple threshold to cross. And I want to call out in a complimentary way, both the employer, who himself makes the journey up to the Galil and crosses over the threshold into a home far less impressive than his own, a home far poorer than his own, and the employee who opened the door and let him in. After they ate and drank, so what happens there? They sit down and eat together. The employee who has eaten for 3 years in his employer's home as an employee is now the host. What an amazing experience that must have been, to be able to host your employer, right? To be an equal, to sit at the table where you're serving him food. And so they eat and drink, and only then he gives him his money, right? The employee understands, he sees the donkeys, but they don't even talk about what happened until they break bread together, until they have this really moment of familiarity, of intimacy around the employee's table. Said he to him, and now, because the employee has let him in, because the employer has sat down, not just thrown the wages on the table and said, you know, I'm booked at the Hilton, I'll see you later, maybe you can join me for a drink. That doesn't happen. He sits and eats the same food as his employee. Said he, and now a conversation can take place. Said he to him, when you asked me, give me my wages, and I answered you, I have no money, of what did you suspect me? I thought perhaps you came across cheap merchandise and had purchased it. And when you requested, give me cattle, and I answered, I have no cattle, of what did you suspect me? Well, I thought they might be hired to others. When you asked, give me land, and I said, I have no land, of what did you suspect me? I thought perhaps you hadn't tithed the land. And when I told you I have no pillows or bedding, what did you suspect me? Meaning those are movables. I thought perhaps he has sanctified all his property to heaven. And again, what I love about this story is how each layer is like very gently unpacked. What allows a person to really be dan l'kaf zchut? It's awareness of the other person's character. The employee has been living for 3 years with this man. This man is a good man. This man is not a cheat. This man is not corrupt. This man tithes his land and lends out his cattle, etc., and gives gifts to the temple. And so even though it seems on the surface that he's being cheated, he manages to draw inside of himself all that he knows from 3 years of living with his employer, and he employs that awareness, that knowledge, piece by piece, because he cannot fathom a reality in which a man like this can possibly cheat him in such an overt, offensive way, Erev Yom Kippur. And so as this conversation unfolds, as he lets the employer know, I thought this of you, and I thought that of you, and I thought that of you, the employer chooses in the next part of the story to share something very personal and very painful, right? Notice how the intimacy unfolds from the moment the employer comes into the employee's space. By the temple service, exclaimed he, it was so. I vowed away all my property because my son Hyrcanus, who would not occupy himself with Torah. Now, I'm going to pause for a minute. What happens here, first, you may have heard of the sage Eliezer ben Hyrcanus, right? So Eliezer ben Hyrcanus seems to be the son of this Hyrcanus. So his grandfather vowed away all of his money because he was so angry at his son and hurt and betrayed that he doesn't want his son to inherit any of his property. And the only way he can circumvent the Torah's command that even the son you prefer less, right? If you have 2 sons and the older son is from a wife you hate and the younger son is from the wife you love, the older son inherits twice. In other words, a son is entitled to his father's inheritance even if he's a wicked son. And this man, whose name we don't know, says, my son Hyrcanus betrayed me, and the only way I can punish him, the only way I can show my absolute hurt is to write him out of my will. Right? How real is that? How many times in history do parents, do fathers write their children out of their will, out of anger, out of hurt, out of pain, And that's what he does. But he can't write him out of his will. He gives everything to the Mikdash, right? And then he can feel good. Everything now goes to the Mikdash. My son gets nothing. But what did he realize Erev Yom Kippur? Who have I hurt? Not only my son, who isn't even in the story, but my faithful employee, who, as we're discovering, is more and more like a son in his faithfulness, in his carefully watching his employer's character. So what did the employer do? When I went to my companions in the South, they absolved me of my vows. Now, again, you may read this story and not realize the depth here. Here is a man who is wealthy. Here is a man who what we call a gvir. He's a man who has land and cattle and movable objects, right? Pillows and bedding and linens. He's a gvir. And he has to go to the Beit Din, to the rabbis who presumably he supports, right? He gives money to their yeshiva. He's the big guy. And he has to ask them to forgive his vow, which means he has to tell them, expose himself around the painful reality of his son. And why is he willing to do that? To let the rabbi see his failure. I say failure because, of course, we can't control our children, but his perceived failure as a father, because he realizes that the person who he's really wronged is this faithful employee who really has modeled his life after Dan L'Kaf Zchut, which is Torah, right? And he says, just as you judged me favorably, may God judge you favorably, right? He says, that's the bracha I'm giving. I'm giving you the money and the donkeys, and I'm sharing with you my story, and I'm giving you a bracha. Because the moment you could have turned and legitimately cursed me, and you didn't, and you walked away quietly, vayidom, right, in absolute silence, b'pachei nefesh, that was the moment I began to think of you as more than an employee. And I began to think about your character and what you were entitled to and what I had done to you. And that allowed me to go to my companions in the South and reveal myself, reveal my secret, expose myself in order to absolve my vow, in order to journey to the North and do what was right. And this story is so complex and filled with layers and filled with pain and filled with the emotional work that allows me to begin the process of seeking the reconciliation and, of course, accepting the person who comes to reconcile. And so I want to contrast Rav's behavior, because Rav Erev Yom Kippur says, you know what, I'm going to go to the butcher and I'm going to make sure he says I'm sorry, because that's what he has to do Erev Yom Kippur. There's no process there. It's Erev Yom Kippur and he's trudging to the butcher. You can apologize now, right? That's not the way anyone is going to get reconciliation. So Rav Huna is right. There's going to be a death, the death of the relationship. In the case of the story, the death of the butcher. In this story with the two unnamed protagonists, we have so much compassion and movement and thoughtfulness and thinking about the other and drawing on those inner resources that we sometimes need to draw on when it seems like we've been hurt by someone we most care about, we most trust. And then in the end, of course, right, he talks about his son Hyrcanus, but his grandson is going to become Eliezer ben Hyrcanus. And in a funny turn of events, Hyrcanus wants to write Eliezer ben Hyrcanus out of his inheritance for studying Torah until he goes to the academy and is bowled over by the brilliance of his son. So interesting, right? These cycles, the way things repeat themselves in different ways, but really the same story. So those two stories are what I really wanted to focus on. And I think we have time for two shorter ones. Okay. Anyone have a comment, a question, a thought? Because again, something that you wanted to share that spoke to you. Maybe at the end, I'll ask you to open your cameras and just share something that resonated with you in these stories. Okay. I'm now going to show you another story about reconciliation. We really could see there are more than I have time to go over. What does it look like for there to be reconciliation? Rav Yosef had a grievance. This is an Eruvin against Rava, son of Rav Yosef. So again, the rabbis sometimes have grievances, one against the other. It happens. The Gemara doesn't even tell us what the grievances are. When Erev Yom Kippur arrived, Rava said, I will go and pacify him. Now, again, with Rav's story in the background, we're like, oh, that doesn't sound like a great idea. Rav Yom Kippur, like people aren't always in the mood, right, to forgive and forget. But what does he do? And here's the difference again between that earlier story with Rav and the butcher and Rav Yosef and Rava, son of Rav Yosef Bar Chama. Proceeding to Rav Yosef's house, he found his attendant engaged in mixing a cup of wine. So he goes to Rav Yosef. Rav Yosef is blind. Okay. He goes to Rav Yosef's house. Rav Yosef can't let him in. Rav Yosef's blind. And he finds Rav Yosef's Jewish servant mixing a cup of wine for him. In the time of the Gemara, you didn't open a bottle of wine and pour it into your cup. You had to dilute the wine, right? Wine was very fermented, very sharp, and you would add water to it. Now, a little bit like how we drink coffee or tea, because we're talking about England, everyone has a personal preference. How much milk do you put in your tea? How much sugar do you put in your tea? How long do you allow it to steep, right? Different people have different preferences. You have to know someone pretty well to know how they take their tea or coffee. Obviously, there are the people who don't care, but there's a certain way how you serve it and how you mix it, right? If we're serious about our beverages. And in the time of the Gemara, they were serious about wine, how wine was drunk. And so Rava now says to the servant, give it to me, said Rava, and I will mix it. Now, what that shows me is Rava knows how Rav Yosef likes his wine mixed. And Rava is taking over the job of a servant. He's going to do an act of service. And he's going to bring it and serve Rav Yosef, which is already an act of a moment of movement towards. I don't just walk into the house and say, hey, I'm here, I'm so sorry. He does something. He mixes his wine and he walks into the room and he serves Rav Yosef. And look what happens. He gave it to him and he mixed it. Rav Yosef tastes it and he remarked, this mixing is like that of Rava, son of Rav Yosef Bar Chama. I love that because he tastes Rava's forgiveness in the wine. He tastes it and he says, my servant doesn't mix it that way. The only person who mixes it with that precision, that exact mixing of wine and water, that's Rava. I've been waiting for him. It tastes like Rava, right? And what happens next is Rava says, Rava says, I am here. Hineni, right? Don't sit down, Rav Yosef said to him. It was actually in Daf Yomi, I think yesterday. Don't sit down, Rav Yosef said to him. Before you, right, there's this excitement. Don't even take off your coat. Before you explain to me the following verses from Midbar to Matana, from Matana to Nachliel, from Nachliel to Bamot, from Bamot to the valley, right? In Bamidbar, there are a few ways we can understand this. One is that he says, you know, I've been waiting for you. I haven't learned Bamidbar since you were here last. Let's pick up where we left off. That's one reading I particularly like, that he's so happy that Rav Yosef, that Rava is here, that Rav Yosef says, don't even sit down. I want to pick up where we left off. It's been so long, right? Let's keep learning. Of course, in a more metaphorical way, he cites a pasuk about a journey. And we're on a journey. We're on this journey together. Let's keep continuing on the journey. But what we see is nowhere in the story do the words I'm sorry appear. Rava doesn't have to say I'm sorry. His actions show that he's sorry. And Rav Yosef so beautifully accepts it by saying, this tastes like Rava. You're here. I'm here, right? So like the work that has to be done, the stage that has to be set, two people ready for that moment and interacting in a way that leads to reconciliation. Okay, the last story I'm going to share, very famous story, and it's one you probably know. It's the story with Rabban Gamliel and Rabbi Yoshua. It's at the end of the second perek of Mishnah in Rosh Hashanah. There's been in general, the end of the chapter shows murmurings against Rabban Gamliel's leadership. Rabban Gamliel is the Nasi, is the head of the Beit Din, but is also the liaison with the Romans from around 85 to 115 CE. So after the Beit HaMikdash has been destroyed, before the Bar Kokhba rebellion, a very tenuous time in our relationship with the Romans, and an awareness that it's going to get worse. And there's murmuring against Rabban Gamliel in the academy for a number of reasons, for the way he leads. Rabbi Yoshua has questioned Rabban Gamliel's authority over the declaration of the Chodesh, of the new moon, of how he chooses to accept witnesses. Okay, that's the backstory. The rest of it doesn't really matter. Rabbi Gamliel sends him a message. I decree upon you that you come to me with your staff and money on the day which according to you will be Yom Kippur. Now, the variant is a day. Rabban Gamliel thinks Yom Kippur is, let's say, on Tuesday, and Rabbi Yoshua thinks it's on Wednesday. Any variant in declaring the new moon is only a day, right? It's either going to be a 30-day month or a 31-day month, right? There's not a lot of variation, but they're in disagreement as to when Yom Kippur is going to be by one day. And Rabban Gamliel says, your disagreement with me is much bigger than you realize, and it's threatening rabbinic authority. And I need to make a lesson of you, because if I don't bring you under my authority, the whole structure is going to collapse. And so he says to him, bring your staff and money. Now, I want to say I had a student, it was actually a brilliant reading yesterday, 2 days ago. Staff and money are muktzah, first of all, right? We understand he's asking him to violate Yom Kippur, but they're also a sign of traveling. Is he about to excommunicate Rabbi Yoshua and on the day he thinks it's Yom Kippur? Is that the day of judgment, right? Is Rabbi Yoshua's day of judgment? And is the judgment going to be keep on walking? You have your staff and your money belt, keep on walking? Or is something else going to happen? What's going to happen? Because the staff and the money is clearly some sort of statement. It's about authority, it's about religious authority, and it's about maybe about being thrown out rather than being asked to stay in. So what happens here is Rabbi Akiva went to Rabbi Yoshua and found him in great distress. And he said to him, and I'll just say there's a variation, Amar lo yesh li lilmod. Who said to who? Does Rabbi Akiva say to Rabbi Yoshua? Does Rabbi Yoshua say to Rabbi Akiva? It doesn't really matter. What unfolds is a defense of Rabban Gamliel. In other words, Rabbi Yoshua knows he has to go to Rabban Gamliel. There's no choice, because he's not going to upend the entire rabbinic institution that exists at the moment. But boy, is that hard to do. And so what he does is he articulates, either he accepts Rabbi Akiva's articulation, or I prefer a more nuanced, layered reading that maybe he articulates himself. The story doesn't make it clear, where he basically says, I can bring you proof. Either Rabbi Yoshua brings Rabbi Akiva proof, or Rabbi Akiva brings Rabbi Yoshua proof, that whatever Rabban Gamliel has done is valid. For it says, Eila moedei Adonai asher tikru otam b'ma'adam. These are the following are God's appointed holy days that you will designate, whether they are designated in their proper time or not at their proper time. In other words, God gave us this time. It's holy time, but it's human holy time. We designate the holy time. Unlike Shabbat, which is divine time, right? Every 7 days is Shabbat, whether we keep it or not, whether, right? If you're in space and you don't know what day it is, you just count the 7th day and that becomes Shabbat, right? Shabbat is divine time. It's sacred time in that God sanctified it. But the Moadim, Asher Tikra'u Otam b'Moadam, you, B'nai Yisrael, will sanctify the time, which means they'll be holy. There will be human error, right? Human error will be part of that process. And so in this scenario, Rabbi Yoshua is only able to really reconcile what he has to do, first and foremost, because Rabbi Akiva comes and says, I see you, and I see this is hard for you. And I want to talk about that role that a friend plays, the community plays, when someone has been wronged by another in the community. Just going over and saying, I see how hard this is. I see how distressed it made you. regardless of who has to apologize. Sometimes all that's needed is that it's seen that we're struggling. And so Rabbi Yoshua, or maybe Rabbi Akiva, begin the first argument in defense of Rabban Gamliel. But Rabbi Yoshua is still not ready. It's not enough. So the second piece is Rabbi Yoshua now comes to Rabbi Dosa ben Hyrcanus, who earlier in the story started the whole thing. Doesn't matter. And then in the Hebrew, Amar Lo, I don't know who says to who, but what's said is, if we question the ruling of the Beit Din of Rabban Gamliel, we must question the ruling of every Beit Din. In other words, at a certain point, you have to submit to the legislation, to the authority, to the judiciary, because if you constantly question, here I am in Israel and lots of questions about the judiciary, but okay, they're not the Rabbanut, right? Questions about the Rabbanut, but they're not Rabban Gamliel, right? So if we're going to question every Beit Din, the whole thing's going to fall apart all the way back to Moshe. At a certain point, you have to accept the authority of the Beit Din Hagadol, because if you don't, there's no consistency, there's no integrity, and that's when Rabbi Yoshua realizes there is no choice but to go to Rabban Gamliel. And what does he do? And so I want to get to the next piece of the story. He took his staff and money, and I'm over here, and went to Rabban Gamliel on the day of Yom Kippur according to his calculation. He does it. It takes a lot of work, a lot of support, a lot of internal conversation with himself, but he goes. And Rabban Gamliel so beautifully receives him by getting up, by standing, right? Not just sitting there and saying, well, glad you came, put the money and the staff over there on your way out, right? Like, it's not cold and it's not passive and it's not taking it for granted. He stands up and he kisses him and says, come in peace, my master and my disciple. And in that, I feel his relief. If Rabbi Yoshua hadn't come, what would Rabban Gamliel have done? He says, my master, you're really my master in wisdom, and you came, and my disciple, because you recognize that without some sort of hierarchy of authority, none of this is going to work. So thank you. Thank Baruch Hashem, you decided to also be my student. And that kiss is the gesture of rising shows the kavod. He shows Rabbi Yoshua. The kiss shows the intimacy, the sense of awareness of how hard this was for Rabbi Yoshua. And the story ends with absolute reconciliation, even though if you go to Masechet Brachot, you know they have another falling out and another reconciliation, very interesting reconciliation there. But this story ends peacefully. And the last idea I want to share with you is really something from David Beshefshin's synagogue, and then I'd really love it if we could all go around and share a takeaway. Forgiveness requires creating space for another. This is from a book called Synagogue, really great book that I've been reading, Erev Rosh Hashanah, that I strongly recommend. In fact, the word mechila, usually translated as forgiveness, may derive from the word halal, meaning space. The act of forgiving is the act of creating space. When we forgive, we create space for another in our lives. And when we forgive, we create space in ourselves by no longer clinging to our wounds and offenses. Whether it is half or whole, the sacred ritual of forgiveness creates space in ourselves and others so we can be absolved and purified. And I really loved that play on words, the mechila to the halal. And what I was showing you in the stories is the stories that were successful were really stories in which space opened up, in which the ability to listen to one another, even if it wasn't verbal listening, right? To pay attention to cues, to dig deep within ourselves, to see if any spaces open up when someone wrongs us, and then we want to get to a right? What that takes. And so what I wish for all of us is, right, the real work of mechila, the opening up of the spaces in ourselves that will allow others also to open up spaces in order to achieve a real sense of mechila, of connection, of forgiveness. And so may this be a year of mechila, may this be a period of time in which we really are mochel ourselves. Often we have to do a lot of work to forgive ourselves, but also forgive those who we love and who are close to us, because that is the nature of relationships. So thank you, Shana Tova. And really, I see a few of you are left. If you could share something that resonated or that you're taking away from our share. Anyone want to unmute and share something?
I liked the thought of that. Well, it wasn't clear who wronged who, but if you feel you've been wronged by someone, that you put yourself out to help them say sorry, that you don't just wait for them to come to you. I've never thought of that before, but I thought that was very lovely.
Yeah.
I'm not sure I'd have the strength to do it, but I thought it was very lovely.
Yes, it's very hard, right? I'm not saying it's easy, but sometimes that groundwork of opening up the space so the person feels they can come in is effective, right? Instead of just waiting. So thank you. Thank you, Tina, also for participating earlier. Annette, can I call on you to share something perhaps?
Yes, I'm quite aware of not jumping on the bandwagon of now. It's something that you need to work on almost throughout the year, but your thoughts are much more concentrated of Yom Kippur.
Mm-hmm.
So it's something to take through the year and beyond, because people may not be ready at this particular moment in time, but there are other moments in time when they are ready. So it's sensing when both parties possibly are ready.
Right. Being sensitive to when the time might be right,
Mm.
and moving towards that, right? Someone sent out a cue, maybe now is the time, right? Maybe I'm sensing something. And yeah, thank you. Howard, nice to see you. I feel like we've met before.
No, I just found it very, very interesting the way you brought it all together, and makes you think about when you do have a difference with somebody, how you deal with that.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you. Ruth, something you'd like to share?
I
Oh, hello. I always think that the examples through stories sort of make you think, they make you sort of relate to it and think, is that something that I've been through? Yes, probably it is. And have I dealt with it in the right way? So I think that was a really useful avenue to go down.
Thank you. Yes. Stories are often wonderful vehicles for pulling us in. And there's often a piece in a story where you say, oh, yes, I can relate to that, right? Relate to it on a personal level. So thank you. Paul?
Very much like everybody else, really. I'm very much into Rabbi Sachs, as Annette will say. So I really like the beginning when you quoted him, and I very much like the end as well, the creating the space.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah.
Okay, wonderful.
Really
Thank you. Thank you. Rabbi Wilkinson, anything
I
you
just
want
wanted to, well, there are so many things you brought up that tangents we could go off on, but one thing that possibly resonates with me, because I was thinking about talking about it in only a few days' time, was this whole idea of going to someone with an apology. And it's, I think at the moment, one of the challenges that we have with social media and emails and everything else is we can just do a blanket, put our entire inbox in there and say, I'm asking for Mechila for anything I've done for the last year. Thanks very much. Love, Rabbi. I mean, yeah, what's that worth? Absolutely nothing. But it's what we often actually do.
Yeah.
And it's maybe sometimes we need to sit back and think, no, there's more to it than just this blanket, meaningless cut and paste, or finding a nice emoji saying sort of forgive me for everything.
Right.
But that's really part of what we have to do now. I've probably wrecked one of the things I was going to say in Yom Kippur, so back to the drawing board, but we'll see what we can do. But thank you very much.
Yes, thank you. You're welcome. Anyway, may you all have a Shana Tova Metuka, Fatima Tova.
Thank you so much, and please God, we will meet with you again. As I always say, it'd be lovely to be with you in Israel, but as a fallback, either Zoom or if you ever come to the United Kingdom, we'd love to see you in person. But our first aim as part of our shul ethos is to come to you over there. But
yes, absolutely. Okay, I appreciate that. Okay,
thanks so much.
Take care. Bye.
Thank you.
Can I just say how lovely it was to hear Ruth's voice? It was just lovely.